Hello, everybody. As you probably already know, it is the 10th anniversary of the September 11th attacks, which took place in 2001. And I kind of feel obligated to make a video about it, just telling the story of my own experience on that day and perhaps provide a little commentary on things I noticed on that day and afterwards, and how it changed our culture, at least in my eyes. Now, I want to keep this brief. I want to make a disclaimer before I start that I wasn't really affected directly by the September 11th attacks. I was only affected in the same way that everyone else was affected, which is still a pretty major thing, so I guess it's worth telling the story. Well, on September 11th, 2001, I was 15 years old. I had just started my sophomore year of high school. That's 10th grade. So I was at the high school, and the day started out as any ordinary day would. Nothing too unusual happened. Now, one thing you have to keep in mind as I tell the story is as the attacks were happening, the school made the decision not to inform anybody of what was going on. They tried to pretty much hide what was going on from the students. They forbid teachers from talking about it, and they forbid people from putting it on the news and everything. Of course, this was in the days before smartphones, so people weren't getting updates from that, but some people still had news services on their cell phones, and some information was getting through that way. But that's just something to keep in mind. I'm jumping ahead. The first indication I got that something was not something out of the ordinary was happening didn't occur until about lunchtime. Yes, lunchtime. After the towers had already fallen. I started to hear some people at the lunch table talk about, well, who do you think's doing it? And these kids were, hypothetically, maybe not entirely serious, suggesting, different countries that could be behind whatever it was that was going on. And of course, I was very confused. I didn't know what they were talking about. So I sort of just shrugged and was like, whatever. Went off to my next class. And every class I went in throughout the day, there was more and more chatter about something major going on, in New York or something. And the talk got more and more intense. By the time I got to my last class, which was like 1:30 in the afternoon, people were saying like, oh man, there's this huge attack going on. They say the Twin Towers have collapsed. And I'm like, the way the person who said it was like, oh, the Twin Towers blew up or something, or like a huge building exploded or something like that. And I'm thinking, what? You're being ridiculous. There's no way anything like that can possibly happen. I thought these people were exaggerating. I mean, I knew there was some sort of disaster going on, but I didn't know the nature of it or anything, because after all, the school made the decision to forbid any discussion of it, basically. And there was a reason behind that. I mean, I live in Pennsylvania, specifically Bucks County, Pennsylvania, which is only about 60 or 70 miles away from New York. So, while it's a bit of a stretch, it's still close enough that some people's parents might have been commuting to New York for work. So there is the possibility that somebody's relative could have been, or somebody's parents could have been, involved in the attack. So that was the basic premise behind the school's decision. Now everyone, the talk continued throughout the day, and everyone was very worked up about this. People were hyper, people were confused. Confusion was the main emotion, I think. Of course, the apathetic, young teenage mindset of most people didn't really see it as a a tragedy, at least at that point, but more as like a morbidly curious thing, like the same way we'd see a car accident or, you know, a murder on TV or something. There's that just sort of morbid curiosity and almost excitement at the fact that something unusual is happening and it wasn't just a boring everyday experience. Um, so when I finally got home, about 2:30 in the afternoon, my mom was watching TV, and I guess she had been watching the whole thing from the beginning. And I'm like, what the heck is going on here? There is is the world ending? The people are talking about all sorts of weird stuff. And so I sat down in front of the TV with my mom, who by that point was exceedingly depressed. I mean, she had been watching this footage for the entire day to that point. And over the next hour or so, I was filled in on everything that happened during the day. I saw for the first time the footage of the planes hitting the buildings, of the buildings collapsing, the famous footage of the buildings coming down and the dust cloud just expanding throughout the city and people running and panicking, all that kind of stuff. Which, I don't really need to go into too much detail about that because you all know, you've all seen the images. But I was seeing them for the first time, and there were all sorts of conflicting reports. No one knew how many had died. The estimates were as high as 10,000 initially, but it was just complete chaos. And I ended up, of course, watching the news for several hours. My sister returned from middle school, and my father returned from work, his old job, and we were all watching it together, and it was one of those things where it's very hard to really understand it if you had not been at the time, but when it's just happened and it's just new in your mind, it's new out there, something that just happened, you don't know how significant of a thing that it is. You don't know what the ramifications are going to be. Like, there was a period during that day where I actually thought in my mind, it's like, oh God, the entire world has changed now. My life is going to be changed completely, and the world we live in is going to be unrecognizable to the world that we had been in. There was even a point where I asked my mom, I believe, like, well, what are we going to do now? And she answered kind of very slowly, or with a very uncertain voice, very uncharacteristic for my mom, who's a very deterministic person, but she was like, well, I guess we're just going to have to try to continue our lives as normally as possible. And that's pretty much what she said. And for somebody who's so deterministic and in control at all times, that's a very, shocking statement to hear. And my sister even, I think she even cried a little bit. She was 12 years old at the time, and she was already a pretty tough girl by this point. But, you don't know at the time. You don't know what's going to happen. I mean, thousands of people are killed in this attack that's not that far away from you. And, a lot of people, most people, I think, at least for a fleeting moment, thought that things were going to be even bigger than they were. Like tens of thousands of people died, that there would be more attacks that could happen anywhere. I mean, that was another thing that if weren't around at the time, you couldn't have the feeling of, because, if they're attacking in New York and they're attacking in Washington, they could attack anywhere. I mean, in Philadelphia, they have evacuated all the tall buildings there. In Chicago, Los Angeles, every other American city, there was just massive evacuations of any structure that could be considered a target. And basically, even though the attack was happening in New York, and Washington to an extent. Um, it was really, in the psychological sense, the attack was happening all over the country because you didn't know what was going on. You didn't know what was going to be, if it was over, if there were going to be more events that were going to go on. So everybody was in a panic. And it was kind of strange because I actually had two things to do that afternoon, and I went to both of them. The first one was like an orthodontist appointment because I had just got my braces off a few months before, and I was getting a new retainer or something. You know, the details of which are not that important. But it was kind of weird because I still went to this appointment, and of course that's what everyone was talking about. Then I had a piano lesson later on in the evening. I went to that, and that still went on, but you know, still everyone was talking about just one thing, obviously. And it was the only topic of discussion for a number of weeks afterwards. I mean, in the following weeks, the scope of the event was known. You know, we kind of knew that it was over in a way, but there was just the mindset. Everyone was rattled. And this rattling went to the core of everybody. You know, nobody was unaffected by this. And it pretty much caused our culture, as I saw it, to make a 90-degree turn and head off in a new direction. I mean, up until that point, the very beginning of the decade had pretty much been an extension of the 90s, culturally speaking. Now, you know, I grew up primarily during the 90s, and it was a time period that was after the end of the Cold War, very idealistic. You know, there were still wars going on, of course, but they were minor, relatively speaking, and America wasn't directly involved in most of them. So we got the impression as kids that all this stuff was stuff that was happening out there somewhere, you know, out in the world. It didn't affect America. We were safe here. You know, we won World War II. We won the Cold War. Our struggles were done, and we were living in a world of prosperity that we created, and nothing could get us, you know. And what September 11th did, the real damage that it did, was not in merely the loss of life or destruction of buildings, which, don't get me wrong, it was a terrible loss of life, 3,000 people, give or take. And I don't mean to minimize that, but, you know, if you want to think of it that way, more people than that die every single day of, you know, malnutrition or preventable diseases. So the death toll in itself, while huge, wasn't the primary reason why it was such an eventful day. It is because what was destroyed was our sense of security, and what was ruined was just our feeling that we were well secure in our country and what we did. And now everybody was just paranoid. Everything was suspicious. Everything could be a sign of a next terrorist attack. And when I say this panicking lingered, I don't mean just for a week or two. I think this state of increased anxiety continued in a high measure until 2006. 5 whole years before there was any kind of, you know, collective deep breath where people started to calm down. And that wasn't even complete. You know, to this day, the effects are, of course, still felt. But just the culture between '01 and '06 was completely bent by 9/11. And it was a very dark time, I think, culturally speaking. And in the last 5 years, it's gotten a little bit better, but we're still not out of the woods yet. You know, it really changed how we've seen things. Well, I'm getting to the 15-minute mark, and I don't want to make this 2 parts. I mean, I could go on, but I think I've pretty much covered it. So if you have a 9/11 story, please tell it in the comments or make a video response. Thanks for watching.